Good morning, Deirdre.
Good morning, Tom. How are you today?
I am great. I've got some friends here with us. I mean, this doesn't get any better. I'm in a beautiful spot. You can tell the Grand Canyon looks beautiful this morning. Um, so, this is about uncertainties. Economic people call them, the side effects of what you're dealing with. They call them externalities. That's what this point is. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Deirdre, and let you moderate and talk about the subject.
Okay. Let me just comment that we've actually been engrossed in conversation for about 20 minutes now. So engrossed we forgot to start recording. But what we were talking about is we're in a very disruptive time right now. We have economic disruption, markets are going all over the place. We have political disruption throughout the world. Right now, the Middle East is in more of a disruptive state than I think most people realize. And we have disruptive politics in the United States, where we've just been on a roller coaster for the past month, up and down, and do not anticipate a peaceful next couple of months until the US election. And we've been talking a little bit about how do people react to this? What do people do? And Tom, you were posing questions, and you know that I tend to work not toward solutions, but toward working towards solutions or toward setting frameworks for solutions. And I'm going to throw out a couple of points here. One is that I think of things like ideas and processes and culture and frameworks as tools. That the more ideas you have, the more frameworks you have to work within, the more processes you have at hand, the more knowledge you have of specific technologies or things like that, the better able you are to work towards solutions to problems. And I think one problem right now is that we are running out of ideas. We are very fractured in terms of processes and tools and the use of technologies and so forth. Whether it's ignorance, whether business is siloed, whether people have just stopped thinking about things in all of this disruption and just trying to do things. And I have my own opinions about this, but I just want to get this out here. I think that people generally are lacking the tools, or that our use of tools is being confounded by things that are just confusing to us. Social media, with all of its disruptive false information, for example, or false censorship, or lack of censorship, or whatever you want to call it. I think a parallel thing, but something that is distinct, is that humans work by what I'll call mind maps. We train ourselves to operate in certain situations. We develop an understanding of how things should happen, and we operate according to our mind maps. This is why in the industrial age corporations, there were management training programs to teach young people the mind maps for operating within the organization. Now, as we've moved into the digital age, what I'll call the business mind maps have changed. But even so, people like entrepreneurs can build their own mind maps when guided by people on how to build businesses, how to go out and do this. I think there's a tremendous gap in the creation of new mind maps, whether it's in business, whether it's in politics, and so forth, that we're still bound in the past and have not really worked on developing useful mind maps going forward. Our mind maps are fragmentary. And I'm going to give you an example. And this is one that truly horrified me. When I first saw this a month ago or so, I just was complaining to Professor Cowan. Harvard Business Review. This is the July-August issue, 2024. And you can see build a culture that works. When I started to read this, I was questioning whether they had gone to the archives and pulled the articles. I don't mean to slander HBR. I mean, HBR does great work and does great communication and so forth. But all of the authors of the articles in this seem to be writing for the industrial age. And the title of the articles were things like Power, Influence, and CEO Succession, or How CEOs Build Confidence in Their Leadership, or The Vital Role of the Outgoing CEO. That's one that both Professor Cowan and I just blinked at. Or Building a Corporate Culture That Works. And a lot of the problem is that the academics who are creating the theories out there and communicating through things like HBR and even in business school curriculum and so forth, have done all their research in the industrial age or are still thinking in industrial age, or they do consulting with large corporations. So they're ignoring what's happening in the business world. Again, I don't mean to denigrate their work. It's certainly valid work. It's just that the application is very limited and it doesn't address the situations that we're finding in terms of different business structures in the world today. Corporations today do not operate in the old strict hierarchies. They operate in terms of teams, flatter structures, or there's a lot more M&A to build capabilities, a lot more creation of internal initiatives to do such things as drive technology and so forth. And none of that is addressed when you talk about the old corporate structures and how, for example, a CEO builds power. Power is diffuse in organizations unless you build a culture around it. And the tools for building culture in any type of entity are different from the tools that were used in the industrial age. There can't be a top-down approach. It has to be a communicative, bringing everyone together approach that aims towards certain things like building knowledge, building teams, building flows of information, all of which are not done in the typical siloed organizations of the old power hierarchies and structures of corporations. I think another thing going on is that, and what I'm talking about right now is last week, Professor Cowan and I regarded my last Nonsense or Not, which was on the book Execution by Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan. And I think that's a terrific book. Yes, it was written based on consulting and work that both of the authors had done in the industrial age, but everything they talk about applies to address the issues that I'm talking about right now. They talk about the need to prepare. And this is the main thing, that the main thrust of my comments right now. They talk about the need to prepare so the entity is prepared to execute. And they talk in terms of preparing to build the organization that can execute the strategy, assuming that it's a new strategy and not just an iteration of the old strategy or just an iteration of an old budget or so forth. And what that means is having all of the tools in place, the ideas, the learning, the people who can do the work, the technologies, the processes that can lead the organization forward, that are not simply iterations of the past. So they talk about the need to build an organizational culture aiming at the future, specifically at the aiming at strategy execution for the future. But they also talk about the need to make sure the right people are in place. And I don't think that people reading Bossidy's book, which is widely read, understand how radical some of the people aspects of this are. They talk about the absolute need for a strong and productive review and rewards process. That is making sure that reviews aren't the simple, bland, legally mandated, oh, so-and-so's a nice person and does good work sort of thing. It's the having 5 pages of text outlining what you do right, where you can improve, and putting a plan in place to develop you so you can move forward in an organization. And then tying your rewards. None of this, everyone gets a 2% raise every year sort of thing. It's that the people who are productive get their large raises. People who are not productive don't get good raises, and so forth. But it's also about thinking about, in terms of preparing the organization for the future, making sure you have the people in place who are thinking about things in the future. And I'm not going to talk about everything that in the execution book. I just encourage everyone to read it. But what I'm also getting at here is a topic of risks. And I believe that all entities are not spending enough time thinking about risks. Professor Cowan's talking about unseen enemies. Fine, but we kind of know what the unseen enemies are. We just may not see them coming, but we know that they're coming. For example, a few months ago, there were very strong sunstorms, which led for most people to a beautiful aurora in the skies. People down as far south as Georgia were seeing things that normally can only be seen in northern Norway, and so forth. What people did not take further is what sunstorms do to our communications infrastructure. Back in the 1880s, I believe, massive sunstorms just wiped out all of the nation's that's NASCIENT, the beginnings of the communications infrastructure, the beginning of wires, of telex and things like that. And so no one can communicate globally for 6 months. Now, we've all forgotten about that, but it happened within what should be memory. And things like the scientists saying sunstorms are coming and they can they can wipe out all of our electronic infrastructure, and it can be down for months. No one's doing anything about it. Yes, it's unseen, but what would we have done if there was less protection by the ozone layer of Earth and our infrastructure, electronic infrastructure had been wiped out? Now, people may think that that's too rare for us to prepare for, but I think CrowdStrike, while it wasn't related to anything Aurora, shows us how people go into wild panics if their communications infrastructure is down, or some, even a partial takedown of some of our computing infrastructure is just down for one day or something like that. But going further, I've always felt people were saying, oh, pandemic, no one could have anticipated this. I've always disagreed with that. I don't think that people could have anticipated the full-blown shutting down of everything. But I think what people could have anticipated is that there might be, we've had enough warnings. We've had several bouts of SARS, so that there may be something that takes down part of your personal infrastructure, so that at the very least, you might have had the beginnings of, okay, if our Toronto office goes down again, how do we maintain global communications? Or do we have the communications tools in place so that we can communicate electronically if the Toronto office is down, as it was, what was it, 7 or 8 years before the whole COVID shutdown, so that we have enough communications tools in place. I think that people are just not planning enough right now. Let's bring this down to today. Let's talk about the Houthis destroying the free flow of the supply chain through the Red Sea, through their bombing. Now, we don't necessarily see, unless we're industrial entities, how this is affecting the supply chain, or at least in the US, we've been protected from it by some degrees. But if this goes on, or if there's a full-blown war in the Mideast and the Suez Canal shipping, and I think most people don't understand how much of infrastructure is still shipped as opposed to flown or things like that, simply because people are ignorant about things like infrastructure. How a prolonged Mideast war could just shut down the supply chains again, and we're back to the situation we were at the beginning of the pandemic. At the very least, the pandemic should have told everyone that they need to have backup supply chain. I don't know, as the pandemic eased, how much companies actually continued with this thinking. So I guess what I'm getting at in a very long-winded way is I think that we have the luxury of being somewhat ignorant and naive about what could happen in the world, and therefore don't prepare for it ahead of it happening. And that this is causing a lot of the problems. For example, Chad, I mean, we should know how we're going to react. We should have plans in place for how we're going to react. We should have communications plans in place and make sure that they still work, that the underground nuclear bunker is still stocked with fresh food, for example. I'm laughing a little bit now because I'm old enough to remember back when nuclear war was a real threat, and we were drilled in schools about, like how to dive onto your desk if a nuclear bomb hits and all of that kind of stuff. But there are a lot of still, if you walk down the streets of New York City, you will still see the entry signs for going down to the nuclear bunkers under the streets of New York City. But no one kept the emergency supplies in these places up to date and so forth. And as for the economic impact, uh, I think that we have been through sufficient downturns, sufficient chaos in the economic markets in recent times. Look what happened in response to COVID in 2000 and 2001. Look what happened in response to the recession of 2008 and 9. Look what happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we know that economic panics happen. There should be ways that we have to get around them and to sustain functioning. And I'll throw something out here because I know you were all technologically literate. In some of these things, like the flash crash of 2010, people are pointing to the automation of some of the technology driving the financial markets as a real problem. Is this sort of thing a problem? Do we need more human intervention to keep things like flash crash? Everyone remember the flash crash?
Mhm.
Okay. Chad, you might not, but the markets dropped because there was automatic selling on the part of a bot. This is 2010, and the markets just crashed, and there had to be a halt on selling, and everything was in chaos for a while. That as we have enough information, it's are we prepared to act on the information and prepare and build it into the budget and not strike it out of the budget because it, quote, costs too much and so forth. So with that, I'm going to stop here and ask for comments. I think I've stunned everyone.
So look, I'll just tell you, this is from living this world for a long time. There are three big items: money, travel, and communications, or think about it this way: currency, movement, information. Those are the three top things that you want to always be thinking about in terms of preserving. And then supplies and security, or meaning, supplies meaning to be able to function. And then lastly, security meaning, three aspects: people, organization, and ultimately, all the things we just talked about, the top four. And, one of the ways that you do this is you allow yourself time. This is what Deirdre was started with, right? She started with ideas and then knowledge and thinking. And it's giving yourself time to do this, finding time and making time for you to just for only a short period of time. And I know a technique that I use is I read things that are completely unrelated to what I do every day. I read a great book, or I read, just nothing self-improvement, nothing. You go back and read something that you haven't read in a long time, and it can be crazy, whatever suits you, poetry, whatever. Or listen to music that you haven't listened to in a long time, and just that concentrate and let your mind go. And then when you come back, uh, even if it's only for 5 minutes, it helps. And you can come back with a fresh view. But when you think about things, and I was listening to what you all said, I listened to Deirdre, it's about ideas, knowledge, and thinking. You all, it was reactions, communication, and economics. So, and then it can go back to, what are the things that you need to function. And, the things you need to function are money, travel, communication, supplies, and security. I mean, this goes back for a very long period that I'm giving you this. And then when you're in a very difficult situation, it's more about money, travel, and communications. And this goes back to setting up, um, intelligence operations in the United States back during the beginning of the industrial age and so forth. And it's been the mantras, money, travel, and communications. But so now that we've bored you all with this stuff, let's come back to, all right, we're facing instability all over the place. And I think it's, who knows why? And it could be, this could be origin of the universe kind of reasons. And we're trying not to burden ourselves at the moment with why, but more about what you do about it. Because as someone who's trying to do something productive and be a good family member and be a good member of your community and be a good member of your household, it's what do you do about this stuff, and how do you keep your mind focused on the task, but also open to when these kinds of things hit you and you have to react. So, Chad, you've been patiently listening to all this. Do you have any reactions to this? Any thoughts that might help, elucidate this or build on it?
I just kind of have been sifting through my own experiences and friends' experiences, and I have a friend who works for a cookware company, and they actually produce and manufacture all of their things in various countries in all parts of the world. And when they struggled with supply chain issues, they solved the problem during the immediate crisis, but there was not a point afterward when the dust settled where they decided, let's figure out how to prepare for this when it happens again. As soon as the problem was solved, they went back to business as normal. And so there has to be a decision to think about these things. And I'm not sure that, and they're a smaller company. They don't have someone who's trying to prepare for the next problem. And that's a decision that I think has to be made step one. And I'm not sure that's always happening with everybody that I've come across.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance. Again, it gets back more to, it's hard to know what the next problem is going to be. It's not likely to be that one, right? It's going to be something you can't anticipate.
Sure. I think we may not have another COVID in the next few years, but you may very well have a supply chain issue again. And so if you can't ship, and they do ship all of their manufactured goods back to the United States, and so if shipping is interrupted, that is a potential problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now you're getting back to what are the key dependencies your organization has, and saying not so much what could happen, not why could something happen, or the specific of what could happen, but the general ideas of what happens if this gets disrupted, what happens if this gets disrupted. And I think when it comes back down to, if you take those top and you extend it to now four, the fourth one in that list beyond money, travel, and communication are supplies, right? And in a business, your supplies are a lot of things, but one of them is your supply chain, obviously. So it's hard to do it, Chad, but I think you're exactly right. And this is where Deirdre's point about how do you generate ideas, right? How do you generate ideas? And I think the way that I've found that gives me the best ability to generate ideas is when I stop. I just stop. Like I'd had enough of the world yesterday, and I just stopped for a while. and it gave me a thought about something, and I ended up mapping it out completely out. But I would never have done it had I not just stopped what I was doing for that 20 minutes and read something. So I think, Chad, you're on a very important point. It's to know that you're likely to face something, so you're not surprised. You know that you're likely to, and then making sure that you think about what are the things that are the most valuable to me to preserve in some form or another to function. And then if I did have a disruption in one of those, how would I deal with it? And do I do anything other than just think ahead about what options may automatically exist that I wouldn't think about that exist already, right? So, Bob, you've patiently sat through here and listened to us, the two of us, talk for a very long time. So, tell us your thinking about all this.
I think it's really important to spend time and effort and be aware of the things that may happen. I listened to the Nonsense or Not on the Judgment book, Deidre, which I really appreciated. Tom gave me that book years and years ago. But that book, and I'm going to look at execution. Basically, says judgments of people, strategy, or crisis oftentimes are deemed good or not in how the execution works. So how did you prepare for all the different possibilities, which is really what Never Split the Difference is about, right? The negotiation book is kind of don't compromise because it might you have a suboptimal outcome then maybe. And then as I was listening to you both, I started thinking, remember Jonathan Goldsberry?
Yes, yes, I
Yeah,
haven't
so
heard that
he
name
was
in a
one of
while.
my I
Yes.
mentored him, right? And we still stay in contact. He's with Deloitte, and part of what he does is like tabletop scenario playing with executive teams. And I was thinking there some of that could be going on in leadership's heads just to start thinking about what might um, be issues or not in terms of money and travel, communication, supplies, and security, but at least to start to think about those things and maybe even do some scenario planning so you can just answer the questions. How is this going to impact us when your employees, your customers, your board, whomever is going to ask you? Um, and that it's important to put time into it right now, or you probably wish you would have once things start to happen. Um, and so many things right now are on the edge of happening, right? It feels like that's how it's impacted me is just
Yeah, that's really good, Bob. I know that the thing that I tell you that I think if you were to do anything for yourself, is one is to make time, right? Periodically, so that you can think about those things you just talked about. And it doesn't take a lot. Read something you don't normally read. Start reading a great book. Not with the purpose of reading it, but with the purpose of just expanding the way you think. Not that you're
Mhm.
going to dig into War and Peace, but more just to have it be something completely different. So like Deirdre said, it changes your way of thinking. Because I think, unfortunately, Chad, you were talking about this too. We get into where we are, right? I've got a problem with COVID. I'll solve it. I'm really good at these problem solving things. I fixed it. Now we go back and we start functioning again. I think it's about breaking that cycle open a little bit. And that's the whole purpose behind these discussions, is to cause ourselves to not come back with an answer, right? But now we've spent an hour getting our mind opened up. And how do we do it? Bob, your point about how do we now, and then how do we sharpen our capabilities? Because that, I think, is the next thing. I think you have to be very sharp, because these problems are, and this is something that Deirdre points out in the AI book that also is worth watching, the Nonsense or Not on the AI book that Deirdre did. This is time is constricting on us, right? By definition, because that infrastructure that we operate on is cycle time is increasing. And so it's happening, whether we follow it or not, it's happening. And you can see when people aren't following it. And this, Srinivas lives it, sitting on the edge of AI implementations. So he lives that every single day in his job. Some of us are following, Deirdre and I, we have to stay on the very far edge of it because of what we do. And we think that's where institutions are having difficulty today, especially the institutions of higher learning. They haven't figured out how to keep up with it and actually even be ahead of it, and that sharpening, Bob, this is the point about either spending your time on something like Voss or spending your time on something like the judgment a symposium we do, where it's just, again, that's keeping your mind open. And then how do you get your mind razor sharp to be able to figure out, okay, how do I deal with this situation at this moment? And there's no secret to this. It is, how do I figure out what to do next? And how much time do I have, not only to do that, but also when is that next checkpoint? Does that occur in 3 minutes, or does it occur in 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months? Right? Those two things are really critical because that influences everything you do in between. And then you take Chris Voss's work and say, all right, how do I now influence all those things around me so I can get to that point? And boy, I'll tell you, learning to think in terms of minutes and make decisions in minutes. And then part of it is, and this is something that came up in the last judgment symposium we did, you as the leader have one more responsibility, your team. You have to immediately say, once you've figured out what to do based on those factors, you have to turn to your team and say, here's your role. Follow. Right? I've got the point, follow. And so in the last one, the scenario was about facing a group of new owners who had decided already what they were going to do with the company. And you have a public company that they just bought out from under you. And you're the CEO, and you found out 5 minutes before that they have an agenda. You thought they were coming to meet and greet. They have an agenda they've been working on for months as part of this. How do you go into that boardroom? Not what do you do, right? That's the negotiation piece. But what are you facing? What do you want to accomplish? What's the outcome that you want? And you've got a team of people that are going in there with you. How do you get them to play towards that outcome? So part of your responsibility is to say, I've got 3 minutes here to figure out and now I've got to figure out what's the best I can expect the outcome of this thing to be. And then how do I use my team to help me understand before I make that judgment, and the team I can collect? And then what do I tell them we're going to try to accomplish in this meeting, and then what the role is? Because what you don't want to have is you don't want to go in there with you having it in your mind, but you've got 3 people in there and they're all they think they're helping and they're not, because they're not on the same page you are. So that second thing you have to do right before you leave your conference room, walking into the boardroom, is you have to turn around and say, all right, folks, here's what I would like to accomplish at the end. Follow me. And then you, as a team, walk in and you say to the one person, in this particular case, Jake got this right, go see if you can get somebody to dig up that work and see if we've got any knowledge about this kind of stuff, and see if they can feed it to us in some way while we're in the meeting. If not, fine, but if they can. And then you go. But then you've figured out, okay, based on the amount of time I have, the situation I'm facing, what is the best I could expect to do, expect to achieve? Then secondly, I've got a team of people coming with me. What do I want them? What they need to know what's in my mind. And then I need to tell them, here's the role I want you to play. And then let's go on in and do it. And then's when you use Chris Voss, Bob, I see you nodding, right? That's when you turn over to Voss and say, all right, I know what I'd like to accomplish. How do I now approach the different moves of the chess pieces to get there? And the big mistake many of us make is we think we're going to try to come to an answer. You don't ever come to an answer. It's what's the next step, right? And in this particular case, it was to buy time, right? You just want to buy time because they've surprised you. Now you don't want to go in there and Voss would say to you, don't go in there and say, we need more time, right? So there's an approach, but then that's keeping those two things, those two capabilities sharp, so that you play them on stuff that you get surprised, right? And keeping those two things sharp while you're doing all the stuff you all are talking about is really critical. That's the point behind this. It's not, we're not going to solve the Middle East. We're not going to solve, the problems that Srinivas's country's got, or the problems that, my heritage countries have, Germany and Scotland. We're not going to solve those problems. That's for other people to do. We can observe them and say, what do they mean, and how do they affect us? And if we're faced by one of the externalities coming our way, how do we approach it? Do we have the tools ready to deal with it? Srinivas, you haven't had a chance to weigh in recently on this, but why don't you give us your thoughts on this?
I mean, I'm again thinking from the organization's point of view. We definitely consider some pointers as part of the disaster recovery and availability planning for the infrastructure, right? So a number of CEOs missed the pandemic, and that we heard through a lot of statements that they considered multiple other aspects, but not a global event, something like a pandemic. So again, I mean, you're updating your manuals time to time. These are the scenarios that we already experienced based on the history, and these are the ones that probably we may have to be prepared. But then time and again, we have new learnings, new things happening, something like CrowdStrike, in spite of having the DR plans, high availability plans, and that's what you have in your KPIs all the time. And that is on the global, when you're looking at the global organizations and the infrastructure planning, something like supply chain disruptions because of a war or something happening in the Middle East, something like Houthis attack, those are unplanned. Again, if you are looking at from a large global manufacturing organization side, multiple aspects that we need to consider and how the impact has to be. And every company has their book of how do we respond, and the number of events that are going to be added to that are scenario planning. It's a consistent activity that should go in. And when I was listening to you, initially I thought, okay, we should have covered disaster recovery plans and what we do as part of the scenario planning when we prepare those manuals or books or a guide for the whole organization. But then increasingly the events are going up. And when you explained about a boardroom scenario where you're not prepared, but the other company or other team that is coming into is fully prepared and worked on that, and you got a tip of that, I thought, okay, I mean, this is something totally different, totally a different aspect. We get to face those situations a number of times. How do we avoid those situations and how do we buy time? I think I need to educate myself on that side of the story.
Yeah, and you're on to the very important point, because we don't know, Srinivas, we don't know if and by the way, we're not even trying to understand this. Was the CrowdStrike a mistake? Or was it driven by somebody that was highly prepared and knew exactly what they were doing and had a purpose behind it? We're not trying to sort that out. Yeah. That's another thing, right, that people have to do. We're just saying, are we prepared? Because it could be somebody that has a very deliberate purpose in why they're doing this. And so we have to think, and I think that's you're onto the important point, and this is the thing that frequently people miss in this judgment idea, is you have to assume that other side is they know exactly what they're doing. They're fully prepared and they have an agenda, and you don't. How do you quickly get yourself in a very limited period of time in the right frame of mind and the right thought process to deal with that situation? That is the most important thing. You as a leader, you all as a leader, that's the most important thing you can do is have those skills really sharp. And that is the thing that's hard for people to get in their mind, right? And that we decided that, I do this judgment thing with some people that live their lives that way, right? That's what their jobs are, is to deal with that in very, very difficult situations. And then it occurred to me that we should be giving these kinds of things to you all to do, right? So that you get to keep yourselves sharp to deal with these kinds of problems, because I think we're going to face more and more of this. I think this just happens to be our list of things, Chad, I see you shaking your head and leaning back, right? Because we can keep a whiteboard, and that whiteboard's going to be a different set of stuff, right? Today it's going to look like this, but I mean, in the future, it's going to be tomorrow it could be a different list of things, which means we just have to have ourselves sharp in this. So, we've taken an hour. You all have been incredibly kind to let Deirdre and I spend most of it with us doing the talking. And in the future, I'd rather have it you all. But, give us your final thoughts. I see Bob, you and Srinivas have your mics open. Why don't you give us your final thoughts? And then we let, as usual, Professor Silverstein gets cleanup. She bats cleanup. She usually does in all this and makes sense of where we all are. So.
Yeah, I just thought I'm going to put the notes I'm keeping on much of what has been talked about the last couple of weeks in like a leadership cabinet of sorts. So I'll have a go-to of frameworks and processes to follow when something happens, not if it will. And so there's a process people can lean into that you're ready to execute. And that you've got easily accessible. That in and of itself, I think, as a leader would be impressive to teams, boards, customers. You're just ready to act. So that's what I'm taking from this.
Excellent. Chad, any thoughts on your part?
I think Bob is thinking really similarly to the way that I would be. I think we're going to continue to be surprised, and we can do to the extent we can, stay informed and have an idea of what might be coming our way. But we might not always, and having a process in place to be able to deal with some of these surprises and have your judgment sharp, that makes a lot of sense.
Good. I'm glad. Srinivas, any final thoughts from the sage of Columbia here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to process this, and I'm thinking how we can build some real life scenarios in my world, which is, from the AI think, what are the scenarios that I can really think through? And this is a very, very good discussion, and multiple schools of thought, and what kind of scenarios we have to think, or we may be coming up in each of the areas that we spoke. Particularly, immediately for me, I'm thinking something about the supply chain and whatnot, the other side that I can come out with.
Good. All right, Deirdre, you get cleanup. And Chad, I just want to say it's a pleasure to have you. I'm really glad you're here, and I hope you take advantage of this in the future. But with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Silverstein to bat cleanup.
Thinking about the story that Chad told about the small manufacturing company, they cannot go back to what was normal for them. They have a new normal here. And I think that ties in with some of what I'm saying. I think people want things to go back to normal always. It's safe and whatever. There is no more safety in the old normal, though. Safety is in constantly creating a new normal. Not that you have to be awake 24 hours, bug-eyed, working on a new normal, but that
I take offense to that, Deirdre, because you know that I do stay awake 24 hours.
24 hours.
Usually
Okay.
Deirdre stop. You know what she said to me yesterday? You need to stop. You're slurring your words. You're so tired. Well, I think that was a direct quote.
Yes. Yes, exactly. But I think, and this ties in with the points I was making about the old thinking and the old mind maps. An old mind map might say we're in a crisis and we get back to normal. And the way out of the crisis is to figure out how to recover the old normal. I think going forward, the way out of the crisis is to create a new normal that works for the entity, whatever the entity is. And to that end, leadership is going to have to step up and have in mind what that new normal would be at all times. It becomes part of the role of the leader to understand what a new normal would be, given all of the possible disruptions in this world, so that when a crisis happens at whatever level, leaders can start moving into that new normal. And that ties in with what I said about preparing the organization and thinking strategically and being aware of all of these things and just thinking and thinking about what could go wrong so that you're prepared to move to your new normal at any time. And I think, Tom, those are my closing words here. It's the preparedness, the awareness of risk, and the knowledge that you're always going to be at a new normal going forward.
So this scene in the background here of the Grand Canyon is a great example, right? This is always going to be there, right? There's always going to be the blue sky on the other side of the storm that's over here, right? I mean, this is the idea that these things are always just passing through and they can be pretty rough. The question is, what do you do about it? What do you do about it? Because the new storm's going to come in, you know, for sure. Enough about that. It's a Sunday morning. Bob, I see it's beautiful where you are. Chad, I see the sun coming through. And Srinivas, I know that you're dealing with kind of rough weather up there with Deirdre. You guys are. I don't know if the moment if it's bad, but
It's better today, but
good. Well, let's hope
It's good today.
Good. So with that, thank you all so much. It's always a pleasure. It's wonderful to have such great people and great minds helping us think these things through and talking these things through. So thank you, and we'll see you all soon.
Bye-bye.
right.
Thanks to you guys. It was really good to be here
Bye-bye.
today.